Welcome to episode 2 of Utility Mode, where we switch on performance in every area. I'm Sophie Curtain, elite rugby league athlete, sports nutritionist, and student dietitian. Today, we're breaking down something that a lot of people talk about, but don't fully understand: the real differences between the men's and the women's game. There's a lot of conversation around NRL versus NRLW, but not a lot of people actually understand the structural differences that impact performance, preparation, and the quality of the game. This isn't about better or worse. It's more about the context of the game. When you understand the context, you'll understand the performance on the back of that. Firstly, looking at the differences between the salary cap and pay. The NRL salary cap is around 11.7 million at the end of 2024 for their top 30 squad. This is based off the collective bargaining agreement that ends in the year 2027, whereas the NRLW is roughly $900,000 to the $1 million range as of recent years. This massive gap reflects the full-time versus semi-professional nature of the sport, or the two different sports. Obviously reflects the revenue differences and how much money is brought into each side of the game. Also considering the broadcast and commercial sales made in each aspect of the game. How that looks in terms of minimum salaries. So the NRL, anyone in the top 30 has to earn a minimum of $120,000. So that could be the 30th person in the squad, or 28 to 30 are on a minimum of $120,000. The NRLW in 2026 will be earning a minimum of $46,800. So that's the top 24 squad. So that's a 2.5 to 3 times difference at entry level. Again, reflected by the revenue differences, broadcasting deals, and the difference in commercial sales. In terms of the contract types, we can see that based on the financial aspect of it all, the NRL is full-time and have professional contracts only. So with $120,000 as their minimum, you can quite comfortably live off that, even if you're not playing NRL in and out every single week. Versus the NRLW has a top 24 squad with development players who are on roughly $16,000 per year. And then in 2026, they're looking to introduce 2 supplementary players who are going to be on $23,000 a year plus match payments. So as you can probably tell, NRLW has a tiered pathway system, whereas NRL doesn't. It just has that minimum standard and the total salary cap. So previously it was a top 24 squad with 4 development players, so 28 people in the squad in total. But now it's 30 in total with the additional of the 2 supplementary players in 2026. As I mentioned, in terms of the rosters for each of the 2, NRL has got a top 30 squad. They also have a development list of around 6 players, but their top 30 is on that minimum of $120,000 per year. Versus the NRLW in 2026, as I mentioned, has that top 24 in their squad. So those are eligible to play NRLW week in, week out. The 4 development players need to be, bumped up or signed to top deal to be allowed to play, but typically are just there to develop their skills, are usually younger players that have come through the pathways and have done well in their respective competitions, and they're just getting an opportunity to train with the top squad to further develop their skills. And with the 2 supplementary players, they basically have been introduced to replace the injury replacements that usually happen mid-season for each team. So with NRLW being such a short competition, any kind of minor injury or relatively moderate injury rules a player out for potentially the entire season. Whereas in the men's game, if you're out for 4 to 6 weeks, you've still got 2/3 of the season to play. Whereas, obviously, as I said, if you do, say, your meniscus and you need 6 weeks return to play, unless you're doing that in the first 3 games and you end up playing finals, you're probably not going to come back in time to play with surgery, that is. So the 2 supplementary players are there in case of injuries that rule you out for the season to allow you to come up into the top 24 squad as a replacement injury player, versus previous years they've had to sign players from reserve grade, whether that's in New South Wales or Queensland, to come up and replace those players mid-season. So they've not done a full preseason with Nrlw. They have potentially never played with any of those players before, having to move mid-season. So it's quite disruptive. And so that's, I guess, kind of why the NRL, or for Nrlw, they've looked at including those 2 supplementary players. As you can obviously tell, the NRL squads are a bit bigger, and they have, I guess, kind of deeper roots in pathways and their skill levels. Nrlw is obviously still expanding, and with the introduction of the 2 supplementary players, I think that'll help going forward with the consistency in performances, knowing that if you do have an injury, those 2 players have been training with you the entire season or entire preseason. And again, in terms of the age, they're probably going to be slightly older players than the development players, so they're not going to need approval to play if they're young, and your development players can actually go to younger girls who are looking to develop versus just having extra squad numbers in your team so that if an injury happens, they can get upgraded because they'll be older than the 18, which is the minimum requirement to play in the NRL and NRLW, unless you get exception. In terms of the game time, the match lengths differ slightly. So with the NRL, they have an 80-minute game and 2 40-minute halves, versus the NRLW has a 70-minute game with 2 35-minute halves. So this is obviously one of the most obvious on-field differences. But in terms of international games, women have played 80 minutes before. And I know that there's, I guess, kind of conversations happening about changing that in the future. But for now, it is 70 minutes, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. But I think in the future that it's something that will probably get changed to match the NRL and having those 2 40-minute halves. But that's going to come off the back of longer pre-seasons, better standards, better pay. Obviously, that results in more intense training, more access to resources and development. And so that's probably a long-term goal rather than something that'll be achieved in the next couple of years. Obviously, can be open to, changing earlier with the new CBA being formed for 2027 and beyond. But as I said, I don't think that's a priority for the game right now. I think they're more looking at improving the consistency in the game, looking to slowly increase the number of rounds or add in more teams before they even consider looking at increasing the game length in the NRLW compared to the international games. Next, we've got interchanges. So with the NRL, as of 2026, you're allowed 8 interchanges in that 80-minute period or longer if you end up going into overtime. It used to be 4 players on the bench, but it has now gone up to a 6-player bench with the option to obviously choose 4 of any of those 6 players. Obviously, the NRLW season hasn't started for 2026, so it's going to be interesting to see if they follow the same suit in terms of having a 6-player bench instead of a 4-player bench. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work because we don't have, obviously, as big of squads. And so if you've got a couple of injuries anyway, you might not even be able to fill a 6-player bench. So it'll definitely be interesting. Say, for example, you have, a few injuries in your top 24. You need your 6 on the bench. You might end up having to have your supplementary players pre-approved to play during that game if, there's an injury in a particular position. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how that kind of unfolds in the coming months with the NRLW season approaching. But in terms of, I guess, the structure, they're similar. NRL obviously has more depth and, I guess, tactical rotation versus the NRLW rotations are often less specialised in terms of the position. Hence the utility mode. NRLW obviously hasn't been around as long, so there's kind of more flexibility in terms of people coming on and off the field in different positions. Obviously, due to the squad size and then also the length of the game that people have been playing in the NRLW is typically a lot less than the men who have been playing since they were, 6, 7, 8 years old. Looking at the rules, most of the core rules are the same, but some of the key differences, as I mentioned, come from the game length. So 70 versus 80 minutes. The pace of the game is a little bit slower. And obviously managing fatigue is going to be different as well with the 10 minutes reduced game time. So we have the same amount of interchanges, obviously, but having to manage, as I said, we have a much shorter preseason. Players haven't been playing anywhere near as long, and we don't have enough time to prepare. And in terms of preseason scrimmages and trials, we don't have as many opportunities to kind of manage our fitness in that aspect. And as I mentioned, there's less positional specialty or specialization in NRLW. You typically have a few players that are able to play multiple positions. But in terms of some of the key rule differences, and not a lot of people are aware of this, instead of the 40-20 and 20-40 in the NRL in the men's game, the women's game of the NRLW has a 40-30 and a 30-40. So you have to be behind the 40-meter line on your own end and kick it out beyond the 30-meter line in your opponent's end. Similarly, you have to be behind your own 30 and kicking it out past your opposition's 40-meter line instead of 40-20 or 20-40. There's talks of a smaller ball size, but at this stage, it's remaining the same as the men's. Obviously, women typically have a smaller hand size than the men's. So as a result of that, to kind of reduce some of the ball carrying errors, they're looking at kind of reducing the ball size. I know there's been mocks made up, and some of the key players in the game at the moment have been in discussion with the NRL in what that might look like and how that might impact the game positively. As I said, reduced errors, better opportunity for offloads and some cool tries from our outside backs, I would imagine. But otherwise, the game is pretty much identical. There's 6 tackles. It's a 10-meter defensive line. Each team gets their one captain's challenge per game. Obviously, if you get it right, you remain it. If you get it wrong, you lose it. The field is the same size. And I guess the leagues are intentionally aligned for consistency between the two. So only those small differences. There's 10 minutes less played each game, and the 40-30, 30-40 instead of the 40-20, 20-40 meter. In terms of the team and competition size, we see in the NRL they've got the 17 teams. So that's Dragons, Roosters, Broncos, Warriors, Eels, Raiders, Tigers, Titans, Cowboys, Bulldogs, Sharks, Knights, Storm, Penrith, and Rabbits. Dolphins as well. And the Bears are looking to come in the near future. So they have quite a long season with around 25 rounds plus their finals with a top 8 system, compared to the NRLW as of 2026 has 10 teams. So this has expanded quite rapidly 12 teams, expanded quite rapidly with the recent expansion, adding 4 teams instead of the 2. So we've got Dragons, Roosters, Broncos, New Zealand, Eels, Raiders, Tigers, Titans, Cowboys, Bulldogs, Sharks, and Knights. They're looking to add 2 teams to that in 2027. Well, there's rumours going around that they're looking to add 2 more teams in 2027. And it seems that Penrith, Dolphins, and Rabbits are kind of hunting for those 2 positions. So it'll be interesting to see how that works in terms of geography. Obviously, in Sydney, it's quite condensed already. So I think the Dolphins will probably be a leading option for that, just in terms of, I guess, the positioning of their team in Queensland. Obviously, they're all spread out, whereas Rabbits is obviously quite close to a few other teams. And, with Penrith's recent success in the NRL, it'll be interesting to see how, I guess, kind of the NRL sees that and whether they think that their success will flow on into the women's game, despite not having, I guess, an established women's pathway in their junior systems and female systems for the last couple of years, or consistently at least. And I guess with that, there's a shorter season with 11 rounds plus our finals, which is, I believe, 2 weeks, and then the grand final. So a 3-week final, so it's top 6. Again, all of this is going to have an impact on our ability to earn more money. It's going to impact the amount of exposure the NRLW is going to get and match experience between all of the different teams. Looking at, I guess, kind of 11 games versus 25 rounds in the men's and women's games per season. So if you're playing 3 seasons, you're still only getting slightly more games than someone who was to play 1 season of NRL. And that's not including finals. So yeah, it's growing. It's better than it's ever been, but it's still needing time to expand. Again, there's controversy about whether it should be expanding in terms of the rounds that are played before we add new teams to maintain a high quality. But again, that's kind of up for debate. I'm torn. I definitely think there's enough talent to increase the teams, but I also think that it would be better in terms of, one, managing injuries, two, managing load and getting exposure for more girls to play more games. Because at the moment, the way it's set out, Harvey Norman, which is reserve grade, and the BMD, which is reserve grade for Queensland, play alongside NRLW now, whereas previously you would play that in the beginning of the year, then you would get selected, do preseason for NRLW, play NRLW. So you would get twice as many games. And then obviously for those who are playing reps, so Origin and your international games are going to get more games there as well. But if you were in that kind of missing middle, you were playing Harvey Norman, just missing out in NRLW, you were kind of too good to go back and play club, but you were just missing out in NRLW. So you were only getting, as I said, kind of those 10-ish games per year, pending injuries as well. So I definitely think there's interest there from players to add more games. So instead of, doing more teams, it gives you an extra 2 rounds every year, potentially doing, 1.5 rounds. So playing 15 games instead of, the 11 games, and then increasing finals to potentially top 8, or keeping the finals the same and playing more games. If you add more teams, I don't think they're going to add more teams and expand the competition in one go. I feel like they'd be too concerned that it's going to impact the quality of the game. So they would choose either introduce more teams or introduce more rounds. And again, controversy and mixed opinions on that. So it'll be interesting to see how they look to expand in the near future. As I mentioned, the structure, NRLW is much shorter. It's more of a condensed competition, and it overlaps with the men's finals period. So the last NRLW round is played in week 1 of the men's finals. So as I mentioned, there's less teams in the final series, so therefore there's 1 less week of finals to be played. So our last round game, is in their first finals week. So for the NRL, it's March to October for the season. NRLW is typically July to October. With the NRL being fully professional, players train pretty much all year round. They're on full salaries. They have access to their resources and support staff all year round, whereas NRLW is semi-professional. So it's kind of transitioning from more amateur to professional, but many players still work and study on top of playing NRLW. So although the contracts are 12 months, or, if you've signed for multi-years, a couple of years, there's inactive and active periods within that. So the biggest real world difference, obviously, day to day, is that we're still working, we're still studying on top of all of the demands and expectations of us to train like professional athletes, despite not having the full funding and support that the men do. And then obviously being criticised for it not looking exactly like the men's, despite obviously the drastic differences in time, energy, resources, finances that go into it. Again, it's better than it's ever been, and it's only going to get better. So we understand, I guess, the impacts that the game revenue and stuff generates is not anywhere near as much as the NRL, but it's still something to kind of consider in terms of the real world difference. As I mentioned, the 6 months on and 6 months off, or the inactive and active periods of our contracts, make it difficult to kind of train year round at that high level. With, I guess, the inactive and active periods, with players still working and studying, they try and do more of that in the off season, obviously, so that when the time comes around for preseason, that they're able to kind of manage their hours and their work a little bit more efficiently to ensure that they're able to get to training on time. They're able to, organize days off with their work, with travel and media commitments and community commitments on top of obviously training. And obviously this is going to differ for each person pending what your job is and I guess what your lifestyle looks like, and if you've got kids or if you're a carer. But it's obviously quite a drastic difference in terms of the expectations of all of the things that we need to juggle on top of training as a semi-professional athlete. Speaking about the CBA, the NRL obviously has had a long-term CBA in place, with the most recent being 2023 to 2027. It covers revenue share, as I mentioned earlier, minimum wages, welfare, and insurance for current and past players, as well as retirement support for those who have finished their careers in the NRL. The Nrlw is in its first CBA, as I mentioned, 2023 to 2027, and it included some broader aspects to the CBA. It obviously considers the lower revenue share, the rapid yearly increases in finances and minimum wages, but its focus was mainly on growth and increasing the professionalism. It's not obviously perfect, and it's going to need to be improved in the next CBA, but it's definitely much better than where it has been previously. So, for example, we spoke about the minimum wage earlier being, I think it was 46,800 this year. So that's 2026. So I know players who were playing in 2021, and the minimum wage then was $10,000. So it was still the same length in terms of the competition. There was a few less teams, but in terms of the training and expectations of performance and travel and managing work and school was much the same, but almost a fifth of the funds that they were receiving. Crazy to think that players are expected to work full-time or study full-time, train 3, 4, 5 days a week for, 4 or 5 hours, plus travel for games, plus pay for parking, plus all of the tolls, take time off work, so they end up losing more money there. Obviously, paying for, external recovery resources, as back then, the support wasn't as good as it is now. So it was it's crazy to see how far the game's come in such a short period of time, but it's also amazing to see the, development of the game in such a short period of time. And if that's indicative of the next, say, 5 years, I can't wait to see where the game will be in, 2030, 2031. As I mentioned earlier, the NRL have got a much more established pathway and have for a long time. With the men's, they've got SG Ball, Harold Matts, Jersey Flag, and then New South Wales and Queensland Cup. Obviously, there are other competitions as well. If you look at things like combined high schools, New South Wales, you've got the schoolboys team, the Australian schoolboys team, and, all your other rep teams. I think there's Andrew Johns and another Laurie Daly Cup in New South Wales. I'm not exactly sure what those pathways look like in Queensland, but I'm sure they're similar, versus the NRLW pathways. And I'll go into a little bit more detail into these in another episode. But for now, the NRLW pathways are looking to kind of expand rapidly to match the pace of NRLW. So previously, when I kind of came through the ranks, there was only Tarsha Gale Cup, which is under 19s now, but when I was playing, it was under 18s. There was no such thing as Lisa Fiola. There was no development pathways. There was no development contracts. Versus now, you've got Lisa Fiola, which is the younger, I believe, under 17s. And then underneath that, you've got some development academies that play, one-off games or kind of competitions on weekends as a one-off. But Lisa Fiola is now kind of a summer competition alongside Tarsha Gale. Then this is kind of where it differs between the men's. There's no Jersey Flag equivalent. So when you finish Tarsha Gale, you either go back to club or you go to Harvey Norman, which is reserve grade. And so there's a big jump there. Now, especially, you've got, fresh 19-year-olds having never played women before, potentially going into reserve grade, playing, ex-NRLW or NRLW players and those that are on the cusp of NRLW. So it's quite a big jump. Then you've got obviously the state competitions, as I mentioned, so the BMD Premiership in Queensland and Harvey Norman Women's Premiership in New South Wales as the state comps. And then you've obviously got your development contracts now for players in the NRLW squads. So the NRL system is obviously quite mature and quite developed, comparing the NRLW systems, which are still building the depth and talent pool. To summarise, I guess, kind of the key points of this episode, the differences between the NRL and NRLW within the salary cap, it's $11.7 million compared to $900,000 or around $1 million. Minimum salary for the NRL is $120,000 compared to the NRLW, which is around $46,000 to $47,000. The squad size has a top 30. NRLW has a top 24. The game time is 80 minutes in the NRL compared to 70 minutes in the NRLW. The season length is quite long in the NRL of around 25 rounds plus finals compared to the NRLW, which is quite short. The professional status, anyone in the NRL is considered full-time, whereas 90% of players in the NRLW are considered semi-pro. The teams, there's 17, about to be 18 in the men's compared to, those 10 to 12 in recent years. The contracts in the NRL are quite standard, but the NRLW has that tiered system. So we've got top 24 development and then your supplementary players. The depth is obviously quite high and quite advanced in the NRL, whereas the NRLW is still developing. So in terms of what actually matters, the core of the game is still the same, but some of the differences come down to investment. So NRL is a fully funded elite system. The NRLW is growing rapidly, but there is still room for improvement and still room to play catch up. The time in the system, NRL players are full-time athletes. And a lot of the time, these young players that are coming through, all they've ever known is rugby league. And so they don't always have experience in the real life working or studying or doing anything outside of rugby league, versus the NRLW players are often balancing multiple roles. I don't have the exact stats on this, but from my understanding, probably 90% of players in the NRLW aren't making enough to live off compared to if they will work full-time in their normal jobs or their normal careers outside of rugby league. NRLW is obviously looking to continue to expand teams, whether that's in the next season, so not this year in 2027, or they look to increase the number of rounds before they add more teams. The salaries are looking to increase slightly every year and moving toward full professionalism. So again, whether that looks like in the next 2 years or next 5 years or next 10 years, with the rate that the CBA has helped support the NRLW, I'm assuming that's going to happen probably sooner rather than later, which is great. Obviously, the games are different because the systems are different. So NRLW is obviously growing quite rapidly and athletes are performing at a high level despite all of the constraints that have been mentioned today. So the context matters when you're judging performances. Remember that we're expected to perform just as much as the men, but with a lot less support financially, as well as access to resources and the stress of having to juggle work, study full-time on top of full-time training, essentially. If this has helped you better understand the women's game, share it with someone who follows footy but might not know what goes on behind the scenes. Thanks again for listening to episode 2. This is Sophie Curtain with the utility mode comparing the NRL to the NRLW.